Don't overwork the dough. Elara, treat it like a secret. If you press too hard, it'll break. If you don't press enough, it'll never grow. My mother's voice echoed in my head as I wiped the flour from my brow, my hands aching from the 4 a.m. shift. I was 22, smelling of yeast and cheap vanilla, living in a studio apartment where the heater rattled like a dying ghost. But I was happy, or at least I thought I was. I believed in things like hard work and honest living. Then he walked in. The bell above the door chimed a tinny, cheerful sound that, in hindsight, should have been a siren. Alistair Thorne didn't belong in a neighborhood where people checked their bank balances before ordering a second latte. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than my entire education, and his presence seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. "The almond croissants," he said, his voice a smooth, rich baritone that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I've heard they're the best in the city." I remember laughing, brushing a smudge of flour off my nose. "You heard a rumor about a bakery next to a laundromat? You must have very well-informed friends." He didn't laugh. He just stared at me with eyes the color of the Atlantic before a storm. I make it my business to find things that are overlooked. For 3 months, that was our ritual. Every morning at 6:05 a.m., the black sedan would idle at the curb, and Alistair would sit at the corner table. My coworkers, Sarah and Meg, would giggle and nudge me, their eyes green with a mix of envy and excitement. "He's obsessed with you, Elara," Sarah would hiss behind the espresso machine. "He's a literal billionaire. He's on the cover of Forbes. And he's staring at your ponytail like it's made of gold." I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that the people's billionaire, the man who gave millions to climate research and spoke about the soul of the working class, had looked through a window and found his missing piece in a girl holding a rolling pin. When he finally asked me out, he didn't take me to a fancy restaurant. He took me to a pier, bought me a greasy bag of fries, and told me he was tired of plastic people. "You're real, Elara," he whispered, tucking a stray hair behind my ear. "In my world, everything is a curated lie. But you're the first real thing I've touched in years." I fell hard and fast like a stone dropped into a well. The wedding was a whirlwind. One day I was counting quarters for the bus. The next I was draped in silk, standing on a private cliffside in Ravello, saying "I do" to a man the world worshipped. My bakery friends were in the pews, crying, thinking I'd won the cosmic lottery. I thought so too, but the fairy tale didn't just end. It curdled. For the first 3 years, I thought the fog was my fault. Alistair didn't scream. He didn't throw things. That would have been too common for a man of his stature. Instead, he practiced a form of surgery on my mind. Quiet, precise, and bloodless. He called it polishing me. I called it disappearing. I remember the night of the Geneva summit. I had spent 4 hours getting ready, wearing a gown the color of midnight. As I stood before the mirror, Alistair walked in, his eyes scanning me with the coldness of a building inspector, checking for a structural flaw. "You look brave, Elara," he said, his voice a soft velvet blade. "Brave?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I thought I looked elegant." He chuckled, stepping closer to adjust a necklace that cost more than my father's life. Insurance policy. "Elegant is for people born to this, darling. For you, it's a valiant effort. But perhaps we should change the earrings. Those are a bit bakery, don't you think?" He said it with a smile, as if he were protecting me from a secret embarrassment. That was his greatest trick, making me believe the world was laughing at me, and he was the only one kind enough to tell me why. Over time, the polishing became more frequent. If I remembered a conversation we had about a weekend trip, he would look at me with genuine concern and sigh. "We never talked about that, Elara. Are you feeling all right? Your mother had that condition toward the end, didn't she? Maybe the stress of this life is getting to you. You should take your vitamins and rest." I wasn't stressed. I was being erased. I started keeping a secret diary in the back of a cookbook just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I would write down dates, times, and what he said. When he would tell me, "I never promised to be home for our anniversary," I would go to the kitchen, open the book, and see his handwritten note from a month prior. I would stare at the ink until my eyes blurred. "I'm not crazy," I would whisper. "The ink is real. The paper is real." But the most painful part wasn't the lies about the schedule. It was the way he isolated me. He convinced me that my old friends from the Golden Grain Bakery were using me for Alistair's money. "Sarah called again today," he'd say, tossing his phone on the bed. She asked for a loan for her sister's surgery. I handled it, of course, but it's sad, isn't it? They don't see you anymore, Elara. They just see a bank account. He hadn't handled it. He had sent a cease and desist letter from his legal team, threatening Sarah to never contact me again. I found the draft of that letter years later. He had severed my only lifelines, one by one, until the only person I had left to trust was the man who was strangling me. I became a ghost in a glass house. I walked through the marble halls of our Alpine estate, listening for the sound of my own footsteps, just to make sure I still existed. Alistair would watch me from the doorway of his study, that predatory glint in his eyes disguised as affection. "You're so quiet lately, Elara," he'd say, sipping his drink. "I like it. You've finally learned how to be the perfect wife." He didn't realize that, in the silence he had forced upon me, I had finally started to hear everything. I heard the muffled phone calls in the middle of the night. I heard the way he spoke to Elena when he thought the line was secure. And eventually, I heard the sound of my own strength coming back to life. He thought he had broken me down into a blank canvas. He didn't realize that a blank canvas is the most dangerous thing in the world. It's the only thing you can't see the trap on until it's too late to run. 10 years later, I sat in our Swiss estate, a glass and steel fortress that felt more like a laboratory than a home. Alistair was at a climate summit in London, or so he said. I wasn't looking for a betrayal. I was looking for a misplaced passport in his private study. A room I was rarely allowed to enter. I bumped a heavy mahogany bookshelf, and a small, leather-bound ledger fell from a hidden crevice behind. A row of first edition classics. I opened it, expecting business notes. Instead, I found a dossier. There was a photo of me. Not a wedding photo. A grainy, long-lens shot of me at 21, walking to the bakery in the rain. Underneath, in Alistair's precise, elegant handwriting, were notes that chilled my blood. Subject, Elara. Suitability, high. No living parents. Minimal social circle. High empathy score. Objective, the relatable wife pivot. Required for the Vane Global. Merger to soften public image of predatory acquisition. Timeline, 3-month courtship. Purchase bakery via shell company Apex Holdings to ensure proximity. The room began to spin. The yeast and vanilla of my memories turned to ash. He hadn't found me. He had hunted me. He had bought my place of work, manipulated my schedule, and scripted our meet cute like a corporate commercial. My entire life, my marriage, my luck, even the way he looked at me across the counter was a manufactured asset. I wasn't his wife. I was a PR campaign in a wedding dress. And then I turned the page. There were recent entries. Photos of him with a woman I recognized, Elena, his chief sustainability officer. They weren't just having an affair. The notes indicated they had been together for 12 years. She was the one he loved. I was just the one he used to make the world love him. A list followed, divorce strategy. Phase 1, question Elara's mental stability. Phase 2, invoke morality clause in prenuppy, plant evidence of her infidelity. Phase 3, total asset protection. He was planning to discard me like a piece of expired dough. I closed the ledger, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could cry. I could run. Or I could remember what my mother taught me. If you press too hard, it'll break. I wasn't going to break. I was going to let Alistair Thorne believe his perfect, simple girl was still sleeping. I was going to give him the grandest, most expensive performance of his life. And when the curtain fell, he wouldn't just lose his relatable wife, he would lose every single thing he had ever built on a lie. The legacy gala was in 3 weeks. It was time to start the prep. The Mediterranean sun was a blinding, mocking gold as the sovereign cut through the turquoise waters of the French Riviera. At 300 feet long, the yacht was a floating monument to Alistair's ego. To the guests boarding the vessel, it was a paradise of champagne and sea breezes. To me, it was a crime scene. "You look distant, darling." Alistair's voice slithered over my shoulder. He stepped into our stateroom, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked perfect, every silver hair in place, the image of a man who had never felt a moment of guilt in his life. "Just thinking about the unveiling," I lied, my face a mask of practiced devotion. I turned to him and straightened his tie, my fingers lingering near his throat. "It's a big night for your legacy. I want everything to be unforgettable." "It will be," he said, giving me that thin, paternalistic smile that used to make me feel safe, but now made me feel sick. "Once the Medici is donated, the Thorne name will be etched into history, and you'll be right there beside me. The girl from the bakery, now the queen of the Mediterranean." He kissed my forehead. a dry, clinical gesture, and walked out. The moment the door clicked shut, I let out a breath that tasted like bile. My phone buzzed in my silk robe. A message from an unknown number. The AR headsets are synced. The hidden file is embedded in the primary server. He has no idea. I didn't reply. I couldn't risk it. Alistair's security team monitored the yacht's Wi-Fi like hawks, but they didn't suspect the simple wife who spent her afternoons reading poetry and ordering floral arrangements. I spent the afternoon playing the hostess. I walked the deck, greeting the sharks of the financial world and the vultures of the art scene. Among them was Elena. She was standing by the stern, a glass of vintage crystal in her hand, wearing a dress that cost more than my first 5 years of marriage. She didn't bother to hide her disdain when I approached. In her mind, she was the intellectual equal, the secret partner. Well, I was just the flower girl Alistair was forced to tolerate. "Elara," she purred, her eyes scanning me like an appraiser looking for flaws. "You look tired. The sea air doesn't suit everyone." "I'm just focused on tonight, Elena," I said, leaning against the rail beside her. "Alistair has worked so hard for this. It would be a shame if anything went wrong." She let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Nothing goes wrong for Alistair. He's the architect of his own universe. He spent years making sure every piece is exactly where it needs to be." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the arrogance, the shared secrets behind her eyes. "You're right. He's very good at placing things. People, too. Especially people," she whispered, leaning in closer. "Don't get too comfortable in that cabin. Elara, trends change, brands evolve." She walked away, a triumphant sway in her hips. She thought she was the one holding the knife. She had no idea she was the one standing on the trapdoor. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, the paranoia began to set in for Alistair. He was a man built on control, and as the unveiling approached, I began to subtly tug at the threads of his psyche. At dinner, in front of a dozen tech moguls, I leaned in and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "I saw a black ledger in your study back home, Alistair. Such an interesting hobby, keeping records of everything." He froze, his fork hovering midair. His eyes darted to mine, searching for a spark of defiance, but I gave him nothing but a vacant, sweet smile. "What ledger?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Oh, the one with the photos," I said, taking a sip of wine. "The ones of me. From the bakery. You're such a romantic. Keeping the photos from when we first met, even the ones taken from across the street." The color drained from his face. He laughed, a hollow, forced sound, and waved a hand dismissively to the table. "My wife is a sentimentalist. She finds meaning in every old notebook." But his hand was shaking. For the rest of the night, he was a ghost at his own feast. He kept glancing at me, then at Elena, then at his head of security. He was realizing that the simple girl might have seen behind the curtain. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't just looking behind the curtain. I was setting it on fire. By midnight, the guests were gathered on the observation deck. The Lost Medici sat on a heavy easel, draped in black velvet. The AR headsets were distributed. The Thorne vision that Alistair promised would revolutionize how the world saw art. "The truth," Alistair announced to the crowd, stepping up to the microphone, regaining his composure. "The truth is the most valuable thing a man can possess. Tonight, we see the truth of history." I stood in the shadows at the back of the deck, my heart hammering against my ribs. My finger hovered over the execute command on the small remote hidden in my clutch. "You shouldn't have bought my bakery, Alistair," I thought. "Because you forgot one thing. A baker knows exactly how to handle the heat." I pressed the button. The velvet on the deck felt like a shroud. 100 of the world's most powerful people sat in silence, their faces obscured by the sleek, glowing bands of the Thorne Vision AR headsets. He signaled his technician. The headsets hummed. On the giant monitors flanking the deck, the public feed began. It was supposed to show the brushstrokes of a 15th century master. But as I tapped the final sequence on my hidden remote, the Thorne Vision feed bypassed the marketing loop. I watched the guests. At first there were murmurs of awe. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't awe anymore. It was the sound of 100 people holding their breath at once. The digital execution. Through their lenses, the guests weren't seeing the Medici. The AR overlay was projecting a split-screen video. On the left, a time-lapse of a modern studio in a dirty industrial district of Marseille. It showed a forger meticulously aging a canvas with tea stains and artificial heat. On the right, a time-stamped video of Alistair and Elena in that very studio, laughing as Alistair pointed to the forger's work. The Louvre won't know the difference. His voice rang out through every guest's earpiece, clear as a bell. And the tax write-off will fund our new island. Elara won't suspect a thing. She's too busy dreaming of sourdough and starlight. The crowd began to rip off their headsets. Gasps echoed across the deck. Alistair's face went from triumphant to a sickly ashen gray. He turned to the monitors, his eyes wide with horror as he saw his own face, not as a hero, but as a thief. "Shut it down!" he screamed, lunging toward the tech booth. "It's a hack! This is a deep fake!" The personal blow. But I wasn't done. The feed didn't stop. It transitioned to the provenance of a wife. The screen filled with the private investigator's files from 10 years ago. Photos of me at the bakery, the empathy score, the vulnerability assessment, the voiceover change to a recording of Alistair talking to his board of directors on a private jet. The girl is perfect. She's a blank slate. No family to ask questions, no money to fight back. Marrying her buys us 3 years of good guy press. By the time I'm done with the merger, I'll find a way to dispose of her quietly. The silence on the yacht was absolute. Even the waves seemed to stop splashing. Elena was backing away, her eyes darting toward the lifeboats. Realizing the ship she was on was sinking in every possible way, Alistair turned to me, his hands trembling. The people's billionaire was gone. In his place was a small, desperate man caught in a trap of his own making. "Elara," he hissed, stepping toward me, his voice a jagged edge. "What have you done? You've destroyed everything. Your life, this wealth, it's all gone." I stepped out of the shadows, my heart finally still. The fear that had lived in my chest for 10 years had evaporated. "I didn't destroy it, Alistair," I said, my voice steady enough to cut glass. "I just stopped the forgery. I thought you loved the truth." "Elara, listen to me," he whispered, his eyes darting to the Interpol helicopter hovering like a giant dragonfly above us. "This is a misunderstanding, a glitch in the software. You're emotional, and I understand why. You've seen things out of context, but we can fix this. I can fix anything." "Context, Alistair?" I asked, my voice carrying over the wind. "The context is that you bought my life. You treated me like a line item on a balance sheet. You didn't marry a woman. You acquired a mascot. I saved you." He snapped, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "You were dusting flour off your face for minimum wage. I gave you the world. I gave you this." He gestured wildly at the $300 million vessel beneath our feet. "Do you think you'll survive a day without my name attached to yours? You'll be a punchline, a where are they now story in a tabloid." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his leather wallet. He didn't even look at me. He looked at the situation as a problem to be bought. 10 million, right now, into a private account Marcus doesn't know about. You go to the press, you say it was a prank, a performance art piece gone wrong. We save the IPO and you walk away a queen. I looked at the wallet. I looked at the man. You still don't get it. You think everyone has a price because you've spent your life buying people who have no soul. You forgot that I grew up with people who didn't have a dime, but they had a spine. "Don't be a martyr, Elara. It's a boring look on you," he sneered, his voice turning cold, his final attempt at gaslighting. "You're unstable. Look at you, trembling. The court will see this as a mental breakdown. They'll see a girl who couldn't handle the pressure of the elite world. I'll have you committed before the divorce papers are even served. I've already told the board you've been unwell." I started to laugh. It was a low, jagged sound that seemed to rattle the champagne flutes on the nearby tables. "I'm not trembling because I'm scared, Alistair. I'm trembling because I've been holding this in for 10 years. I stepped into his personal space, forcing him to look at the blank slate he thought he had mastered. "Do you remember Geneva? When you told me I looked brave because I wasn't born for this? Do you remember when you told me my friends were vultures, just so I'd have no one to turn to but you? You told me I was polishing into the perfect wife." I leaned in, my voice a lethal whisper. "A diamond is just a piece of coal that handled the pressure, Alistair. You pressured me for a decade. You didn't make a wife, you made a weapon." The helicopter searchlight swept over us, blinding him for a moment. In that light, he looked ancient. "The money is gone," I continued. "The New Life Fund didn't just buy your patents. I used your own morality clause, the one you wrote to keep me quiet to void your ownership of the Thorne Foundation. You're standing on a boat that technically belongs to a charity for underprivileged women now. So technically, Alistair, you're trespassing. He lunged for me, a flash of the predator finally breaking through the polished CEO. You! I built this! He was tackled before he could even touch my sleeve. 2 Interpol officers forced him to the deck, his face pressed against the very teak wood he had bragged about importing from Myanmar. I looked down at him. You always said a masterpiece is defined by its provenance, the story of where it came from. My story started in a bakery with a man who lied about a croissant. Your story ends here, on a fake boat, with a fake painting, and a wife you never bothered to truly meet. I turned to the lead officer. He's all yours. Watch out for the CEO voice. It's his only real skill. Just then, the sound of heavy rotors thrashed the air. A black helicopter with Interpol markings circled the yacht, its searchlight pinned on Alistair like a bug under a microscope. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single, crumpled white paper. It wasn't the surrender of assets yet. It was a photo of my mother's bakery, the day it closed down. You thought I was a blank slate, Alistair. You thought I was something you could knead and bake into whatever shape you wanted. I leaned in close, so only he could hear me over the wind of the helicopter. But a baker knows the most important rule. If you leave something in the heat too long, it doesn't just change. It burns. As the first officers rappelled down onto the deck, I didn't look back. I walked toward the VIP helipad where my own transport was waiting the one. I'd paid for using the slush fund he thought I never noticed. The helicopter blades whipped, my hair across my face as I stood on the edge of the helipad, looking down at the chaos on the deck of the Sovereign. Below me, the man who had bought my life was being pressed against the mahogany railing, his expensive tuxedo jacket bunched in the fists of an Interpol agent. Alistair looked up at me, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He tried to shout something, but the wind swallowed his words. It didn't matter. I already knew his script. I made you. You're nothing without me. But as I looked down, I didn't see a titan of industry. I saw a small man standing in a circle of flashing blue and red lights, surrounded by the very elite who were already busy deleting his contact info from their phones. Elena was being led away in separate zip ties, her designer heels clicking frantically on the deck. She looked toward Alistair for help, but he wouldn't even look at her. To a predator like Alistair, an exposed partner isn't a lover. She's a liability. As we leveled out over the dark expanse of the Mediterranean, my lawyer, Marcus, handed me a tablet. The video has 3 million views already, Elara, he said, his voice brimming with professional satisfaction. The Bakery to Billionaire's betrayal story is trending globally. The board of Thornvane Global has already issued a statement distancing themselves from Alistair. They've invoked the keyman exit clause. And the assets? I asked, looking out at the lights of the coast. Because the morality clause in your prenup was written to protect him from you. It backfired spectacularly, Marcus explained. The moment he was filmed, admitting to criminal fraud and the premeditated manipulation of your marriage, the clause triggered in your favor. You don't just get a settlement, Elara. You get the foundation. All of it. The new legacy. 6 months later, the smell of yeast and vanilla was no longer a haunting memory. It was my empire. I didn't go back to the tiny studio apartment. Instead, I stood in the flagship headquarters of the Hearth Initiative. We didn't just sell bread. We funded vocational training for women who had been erased by powerful men. I looked at the wall of my office. Hanging there wasn't a Renaissance masterpiece or a forgery. It was a simple, framed photo of my mother's old bakery, the one Alistair had tried to use as bait. My phone buzzed. A news alert. Alistair Thorne, sentenced to 15. Years for forgery and wire fraud. There was a grainy photo of him in a jumpsuit, looking gray and hollowed out. He looked like a sketch that hadn't been finished. I walked out to the floor of my new kitchen, picking up a piece of dough. My hands were no longer shaking. They were steady, dusted with flour, and finally, truly mine. I looked at the young woman working the morning shift, her eyes bright with the same dreams I once had. I leaned over and whispered the only bit of truth I had left from the old days. Don't let them press too hard, honey. You're the one who decides when it's done.